Ever wonder how the biggest car company in the world almost destroyed itself with a single engine? In 1970, General Motors controlled nearly half the American car market. They were untouchable, invincible. Then they built an engine so catastrophically bad it would haunt them for decades. This is the story of the Vega 2300, the aluminum disaster that GM desperately tried to hide. And picture this. It's September 1968, and Ed Cole, GM's president and the genius behind the small block Chevy V8, stands before the board of directors with a revolutionary promise. He's holding a piece of aluminum that weighs less than a coffee mug. "Gentlemen," he says, "this is the future. We're going to build an engine that'll make Ford's Pinto look like a Model T. All aluminum, die-cast, no cylinder liners, half the weight, twice the fuel economy, and we'll build it for less than anyone thought possible." The board members lean forward. Cole continues, "We'll produce 2,000 of these engines per day. It'll be the most advanced four-cylinder ever mass-produced in America." One executive asks about development time. Cole's response, are 24 months from approval to production. The room goes silent. That timeline was insane. Ford took 4 years to develop the Pinto's engine, but this was Ed Cole talking, the man who'd revolutionized GM's engine program in the 1950s. If anyone could pull it off, it was him. And the Chevrolet Vega and its 2300 engine weren't just another economy car project. They represented GM's entire strategy for the 1970s. This was supposed to be their answer to the import invasion, their technological masterpiece, their proof that American engineering could beat anyone. Instead, it became an engineering nightmare that cost billions, destroyed customer trust, and exposed the rot at the heart of GM's corporate culture. But the real story isn't just about a bad engine. It's about what happens when cost-cutting becomes more important than engineering, when deadlines matter more than testing, and when a company becomes so arrogant it ignores its own engineers' warnings. And to understand why the Vega 2300 was such a catastrophe, we need to travel back to 1968. The world was changing fast. The Volkswagen Beetle was selling 400,000 units a year in America. Toyota was gaining ground with the Corolla. Datsun was expanding rapidly. These imports were reliable, fuel-efficient, and cheap. GM's smallest car, the Corvair, was a sales disaster after Ralph Nader's attacks. The Nova was too big and thirsty to compete with imports. GM needed something revolutionary, not evolutionary. And the automotive landscape of 1970 looked nothing like today. The average American car weighed 3,100 pounds. V8s dominated. A good fuel economy meant 15 miles per gallon. The muscle car era was at its peak. The Chevelle SS454 made 450 horsepower. The Plymouth Hemi Cuda ruled the streets. But storm clouds were gathering. Insurance companies were raising rates on performance cars. California was implementing emission standards. The Clean Air Act was coming, and those little Japanese cars kept taking more market share. GM's executives saw the writing on the wall. They needed a small car, and they needed it fast. Here's where things get interesting. Ed Cole didn't just want to build a small car, he wanted to revolutionize manufacturing itself. The plan was audacious. First, they designed an all-aluminum engine using die-casting technology borrowed from aerospace. No iron cylinder liners, just silicon-impregnated aluminum bore surfaces. Reynolds Aluminum promised this would work. The block would weigh 36 pounds versus 90 for iron. Revolutionary. Second, they'd build the most automated assembly plant in history at Lordstown, Ohio. Robots would do 95% of the welding. They'd produce 100 cars per hour, twice the industry standard. Third, they'd transport the cars vertically on special rail cars, fitting 30 Vegas where normally 15 cars would fit. Shipping costs would plummet. Fourth, and this was Cole's masterstroke, they'd undercut every import on price while delivering superior technology. The target? $2,000 base price. The Pinto cost $2,100. The Beetle was $1,800, but the Vega would have overhead cams, aluminum construction, and modern styling. On paper, it was brilliant. The development team got their marching orders in late 1968. They had less than 2 years to create an entirely new platform, engine, and manufacturing process. For context, the typical development cycle was 4 to 5 years. Ford spent 4 years on the Pinto. Chrysler took 5 years for the Plymouth Cricket. GM was attempting the impossible. However, the engine team, led by Chief Engineer Calvin Werner, faced the biggest challenge. The 2300cc inline-4 had specifications that looked fantastic on paper. Displacement was 140 cubic inches, perfectly sized for the compact market. The aluminum die-cast block used Reynolds A390 alloy with 17% silicon content. This high silicon content was supposed to create hard silicon particles at the cylinder bore surface, eliminating the need for iron liners. The overhead cam design put the camshaft directly above the valves, reducing reciprocating mass and allowing higher RPM operation. The cast iron head might seem contradictory, but GM claimed it provided better thermal characteristics and cost less than aluminum. Bore and stroke measured 3.5x 3.625 inches, a slightly over-square design favoring higher RPM operation, and initial output targets were 90 horsepower at 4,800 RPM and 136 lb-ft of torque at 2,400 RPM. Not spectacular, but adequate for a 2,200-pound car. Compression ratio was 8.5.1, conservative to run on regular gasoline. The engine featured hydraulic valve lifters, eliminating maintenance. A single-barrel Rochester monojet carburetor handled fuel delivery. The cooling system capacity was 6.5 quarts with a 195-degree thermostat. Everything looked perfect in the design phase. CAD simulations showed excellent thermal management. Prototype engines ran beautifully in the test cells. GM's marketing department was already preparing advertisements calling it "Rays, the most advanced subcompact engine in America." But here's the thing about engineering. What works in the lab doesn't always work in the real world. And GM was about to learn this lesson in the most expensive way possible. The first warning signs appeared during hot weather testing in Phoenix, summer 1969. Test drivers reported alarming observations. Oil consumption was excessive. Some engines burned a quart every 300 miles. Coolant temperatures spiked above 260 degrees in stop-and-go traffic. The aluminum bore surfaces showed unusual wear patterns after just 5,000 miles. One test engine seized completely at 7,500 miles. The post-mortem was disturbing. The silicon particles hadn't distributed evenly, leaving soft aluminum exposed to the piston rings. The test team recommended immediate changes: add iron cylinder liners, increase cooling system capacity, redesign the head gasket, improve oil control rings. Their report concluded, the engine is not ready for production. But Ed Cole had promised the board 1971 model year introduction. Lordstown was already under construction. Marketing had announced the Vega to dealers. There was no turning back. Cole's response to the test results? Is make it work with what we have. Every new engine has teething problems. The development team was ordered to find solutions without major redesign. No iron liners, too expensive, and would require retooling. No significant cooling system changes, would affect styling. No delay in production start. Lordstown was on schedule. So what was actually going wrong? The problems were fundamental, rooted in the basic design. Let's start with the aluminum bore disaster. Reynolds A390 alloy contained 17% silicon, which should have created a wear-resistant surface. In laboratory conditions, it did. But in production, the die casting process couldn't maintain consistent silicon distribution. The silicon particles clustered unpredictably. Some areas had too much silicon, creating hard spots that wore the piston rings. Other areas had too little, leaving soft aluminum exposed. The pistons and rings scraped against this uneven surface, creating accelerated wear. Aluminum particles contaminated the oil, turning it into grinding paste. As the bore wore, compression dropped, oil consumption increased, and power fell off. By 10,000 miles, many engines had oval-shaped cylinders. The fix would have been simple, iron cylinder liners like every other aluminum engine used, but that would add $14 per engine and require redesigning the block. Management said no, and the cooling system was criminally undersized. The radiator was designed for a 1.6-liter engine to save money, but they were cooling a 2.3-liter engine that ran hotter due to aluminum's thermal properties. The water passages in the block were too narrow, another cost-saving measure. The single-row radiator couldn't dissipate heat fast enough. In traffic, temperatures soared. The aluminum expanded more than the iron head, stressing the head gasket. The head gasket itself was a disaster. It had to seal between dissimilar metals with different expansion rates. The aluminum block expanded 2.3 times more than the iron head when heated. This created shearing forces the gasket couldn't handle. GM used a composition gasket instead of steel core to save 87 cents per engine. It would fail catastrophically, usually between 20,000 and 30,000 miles. When it failed, coolant entered the cylinders, hydrolocking the engine, or oil mixed with coolant, creating chocolate milk that destroyed bearings. Either way, the engine was toast. The oil control was abysmal. The piston rings were specified for iron bores, not aluminum. They couldn't maintain proper tension against the wearing surface. Oil scraped past into the combustion chambers. Burn rates of 1 quart per 500 miles were common. Some engines burned a quart every 200 miles. The valve stem seals were inferior, adding to consumption. GM used simple O-ring seals instead of positive seals to save 40 cents per engine. They'd fail within 15,000 miles, adding another path for oil consumption. Owners reported blue smoke on startup and acceleration. Spark plugs fouled constantly. Catalytic converters, mandated in 1975, would clog from oil contamination when it's in. But wait, there's more. The camshaft drive belt was underspecified. GM used a 0.44-inch wide belt, where competitors used 0.75-inch. It saved $1.20 per engine. The belt would snap without warning, usually between 30,000 and 40,000 miles. When it broke, the valves stopped moving while pistons kept pumping. In an interference engine, valves hit pistons. Bent valves, damaged pistons, sometimes cracked heads. A $1.20 savings created $500 repair bills, nunch end September 10, 1970. The first Vega rolls off the Lordstown assembly line. GM executives gather for photos. Ed Cole personally drives it off the line, smiling for cameras. The advertising campaign launches with the tagline, "Yours is the little car that does everything well." Motor Trend, influenced by GM's advertising dollars and prototype ringers, names it Car of the Year for 1971. The automotive press raves about its modern engineering and attractive styling. Initial sales are strong, 277,000 units in the first year. GM executives congratulate themselves. They'd beaten the imports at their own game. Or so they thought. 1 yen by, early 1971, warranty claims were flooding in. Dealers reported engines consuming massive amounts of oil. Overheating was epidemic. Head gaskets failed at alarming rates. The Lordstown plant, pushing for record production speeds, had quality problems. Workers, angry about the pace and layoffs, were sabotaging cars. Dealers found Coke bottles welded inside doors, bolts left loose, wires cut. The automated welding robots couldn't maintain consistency. Body panels didn't fit. Water leaked in everywhere. Paint peeled within months. The situation at Lordstown deserves special attention. GM had promised this would be the future of manufacturing. The reality was a nightmare. The plant was designed to produce 100 cars per hour, the fastest rate in the industry. Workers had 36 seconds to complete their tasks. Previous plants allowed 60 seconds. The United Auto Workers filed grievances daily. Absenteeism hit 20%. The workers weren't lazy. They were pushed beyond human limits. Quality suffered accordingly. Management's response? Speed up the line to make up for repairs. This created more defects, requiring more repairs, creating a death spiral of quality problems. And on internal GM documents, later revealed in lawsuits, showed engineers begging for fixes. A memo from February 1971 stated, "A catastrophic engine failures increasing. Recommend immediate implementation of cylinder liner program." The response from management find cost prohibitive. Investigate alternatives. Doc. Another memo from May 1971, a cooling system inadequate for southern states, engines failing at unprecedented rates. Management's reply or add cooling system warnings to owner's manual. A desperate plea from September 1971, we're destroying our reputation. These engines won't last 50,000 miles. The executive response, focus on reducing warranty costs, not extending coverage. And by 1972, the horror stories were everywhere. A Vega owner in Phoenix watched his temperature gauge peg, then his engine seized on the freeway. Tow bill, engine replacement, rental car, total cost $2,800 on a car that cost $2,200 new. A teacher in Ohio went through 3 engines in 18 months. Each time, GM claimed Hyler's unusual driving conditions, voided the warranty. A family in Texas had their Vega catch fire when the overheated engine ignited oil residue. They escaped, but the car was totaled. GM claimed no fault, and the automotive press, initially supportive, turned savage. Car and Driver published Here's the Vega, GM's ghastly mistake. Road and Track documented a test car that burned 5 quarts of oil in 3,000 miles. Consumer Reports rated it HARS, not acceptable, their worst rating. The public responded accordingly. Sales dropped from 277,000 in 1971 to 200,000 in 1972, despite heavy discounting. And inside GM, panic was setting in. The Vega was supposed to generate $500 million in profits. Instead, warranty costs were approaching $200 million annually. The damage to GM's reputation was incalculable. Customers who'd bought Vegas were switching to imports permanently. The average Vega owner would never buy another GM product. Dealers were in revolt. They couldn't sell Vegas sitting on their lots. Trade-in values plummeted. A 1-year-old Vega worth $2,200 new might bring $800 on trade. Dealers were refusing allocation. Some threatened to drop Chevrolet franchises. And so, GM did what GM did best in the 1970s. They covered it up and hoped the problem would go away. The official response was denial. GM claimed the problems were exaggerated. They blamed customers for insufficient maintenance. They quietly extended warranties but made claims difficult. They introduced arched improvements without admitting failures. For 1972, they added a coolant overflow tank. Not a larger radiator, just an overflow tank. They revised the piston rings. Not new rings designed for aluminum, just slightly different iron rings. They improved the head gasket. Not a proper steel core gasket, just a slightly better composition gasket. They offered a high-performance option with iron cylinder liners. They didn't admit the standard engine was flawed, just that some customers wanted our extra durability. The 1973 model year brought more Band-Aids, larger radiator, still inadequate, improved oil control rings, still wrong for aluminum bores, better valve stem seals, still not positive seals, modified camshaft drive belt, still too narrow. GM spent millions on these half measures instead of fixing the fundamental problems. Why? Because admitting fault would trigger recalls, lawsuits, and corporate humiliation. Ed Cole's reputation was on the line. He'd push this engine through despite warnings. Admitting failure would end his career. But the real story wasn't just engineering failure, it was corporate culture failure. GM in 1970 was the largest corporation in the world. They had more engineers than NASA. Their research budget exceeded most countries' defense spending. They had every resource needed to build a world-class engine. Instead, they produced a disaster. Why? The answer lies in GM's toxic culture of the era. Finance dominated engineering. Bean counters overruled designers. Cost reduction trumped quality. Meeting deadlines mattered more than meeting specifications. The corporation had become so large, so bureaucratic, that information couldn't flow properly. Engineers knew the problems, but couldn't reach decision makers. Middle management filtered bad news to protect their careers. Senior executives lived in an echo chamber of positive reports. Ed Cole, despite his engineering background, had become a corporate politician. He couldn't admit error without losing face. The board of directors, focused on quarterly profits, wouldn't approve expensive fixes. The result was predictable. Short-term thinking created long-term disaster. By 1974, the situation was unsustainable. GM quietly introduced significant changes without fanfare. New Durabuilt 2300 engine featured real improvements, silicon-etched aluminum bores with iron plating process. Still not proper liners, but better than nothing. Redesigned pistons and rings specifically for aluminum bores. Larger radiator and improved water pump. Steel core head gasket, finally. Improved valve stem seals and wider camshaft belt. These changes added $67 per engine. GM should have spent this from day one. Instead, they destroyed their reputation to save pennies. The 1975 model year brought another attempt at salvation, the Cosworth Vega. GM partnered with Cosworth Engineering of England to create a high-performance variant. Twin-cam 16-valve head designed by Keith Duckworth himself. 110 horsepower from 2.0 liters, impressive for the era. Fuel injection instead of carburation, proper forged pistons and iron cylinder liners. The Cosworth Vega was everything the standard engine should have been. It was also too expensive at $6,000 and too late to matter. Only 3,508 were built. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Vega wasn't just failing in isolation. It was part of a pattern of GM disasters in the 1970s. The Cadillac 8-6-4 variable displacement engine that never worked properly. The Oldsmobile diesel that destroyed itself. The Chevrolet Citation with steering that could disconnect. The Pontiac Fiero that caught fire. Each failure had the same root causes: rushed development, cost-cutting over engineering, ignoring problems, covering up failures. The Vega 2300 was patient zero in GM's quality epidemic. The consequences extended far beyond warranty claims. GM lost an entire generation of buyers to imports. Young people who bought Vegas in 1971 bought Toyotas in 1975 and never came back. The compact car market, which GM should have dominated, became Japanese territory. GM's market share began its long decline from 45% in 1970 to bankruptcy in 2009. You can draw a straight line from the Vega to GM's collapse. It wasn't the only cause, but it was the first symptom of terminal disease. Let's talk about what this disaster actually cost. GM never released complete figures, but internal documents suggest the truth. Development costs, $300 million, twice the budget. Warranty claims, $800 million over 7 years. Lost sales from reputation damage, estimated $2 billion. Legal settlements, $100 million minimum. Brand damage, incalculable. The total direct cost probably exceeded $3 billion in 1970s dollars. That's $15 billion today. For one bad engine, but the human cost was worse. Thousands of customers stranded by failed engines, families who couldn't afford repairs on cars that shouldn't have broken, Workers at Lordstown driven to physical and mental breakdown, dealers who lost their businesses, engineers whose warnings were ignored, watching their predictions come true. Ed Cole retired in 1974, his reputation tarnished. He died in a plane crash in 1977, never seeing GM recover. Calvin Werner, the engine's chief engineer, left automotive engineering entirely. The Lordstown plant became synonymous with labor problems and poor quality. The workers weren't the problem, the system was broken. The Vega limped on until 1977, accumulating more Band-Aids each year. The final versions were actually decent cars. The 1976-1977 models with Dura-built engines could go 100,000 miles with proper maintenance, but it was too late. The reputation was destroyed. Final production totaled 10,547 units. Sounds impressive until you realize Ford sold that many Pintos in half the time. Toyota sold more Corollas every single year. The Vega became a punchline, a cautionary tale, a symbol of everything wrong with American auto manufacturing, and modern engineers study the Vega 2300 as a perfect storm of failure. Every possible mistake was made. Unproven technology rushed to production, cost-cutting in critical areas, ignoring test results and engineer warnings, pushing manufacturing beyond sustainable limits, covering up problems instead of fixing them, prioritizing schedules over quality, letting finance override engineering. It's a master class in how not to develop an engine. The technical innovations that should have worked became nightmares. Die-cast aluminum blocks are now common, but with iron liners or special coatings. Silicon-impregnated bores work in racing engines with careful preparation. Overhead cam designs dominate modern engines. The ideas weren't wrong, the execution was criminal. GM proved advanced concepts could work, then proved they wouldn't invest properly to make them reliable. The irony is that GM knew how to build good engines. The small block V8 was bulletproof. The Buick 231 V6 was excellent. The Iron Duke four-cylinder, introduced in 1977, was crude but reliable. GM could have put a conventional iron engine in the Vega and avoided disaster. But that wouldn't have been revolutionary. Ed Cole wanted to change the world. Instead, he destroyed GM's future. 1010 today. Finding an original Vega with its 2300 engine running is nearly impossible. Most were scrapped or re-engined long ago. The few survivors are curiosities at car shows, reminders of corporate hubris. Collectors prefer Cosworth Vegas, the only variant worth preserving. Standard Vegas are worthless, even in perfect condition. The market has rendered its verdict. But the lessons of the Vega 2300 remain relevant. Modern manufacturers still rush products to market. Cost-cutting still compromises quality. Marketing still overrides engineering. Cover-ups still happen. Volkswagen's diesel scandal, Toyota's unintended acceleration, GM's ignition switches. The same patterns repeat because corporate culture hasn't fundamentally changed. Quarterly profits still matter more than long-term reputation. Executive bonuses still reward cutting costs, not ensuring quality. The pressure to beat competitors still creates impossible deadlines. On what could GM have done differently? Everything. They should have taken proper development time, 4 years minimum. They should have tested thoroughly in all conditions. They should have listened to engineers who warned of problems. They should have used proven technology like iron cylinder liners. They should have sized components properly, not minimally. They should have fixed problems immediately when discovered. They should have admitted mistakes and issued recalls. They should have prioritized customer satisfaction over short-term profits. They should have remembered that reputation takes decades to build and moments to destroy. And on the aluminum bore issue alone deserved proper resolution. Mercedes-Benz used aluminum blocks with iron liners successfully. Porsche used Nikasil coatings on aluminum. BMW developed Alusil with proper silicon distribution. Solutions existed, GM just wouldn't pay for them. Saving $14 per engine cost them billions in the end. In the Vega 2300 story is ultimately about corporate arrogance meeting physical reality. You can't negotiate with thermodynamics, you can't cost-cut metallurgy, you can't rush chemistry, you can't ignore physics. The laws of nature don't care about quarterly earnings or production schedules. An engine either works or it doesn't. The Vegas didn't. Consider what GM could have built with proper investment. An aluminum engine with iron liners would have been lightweight and durable. Proper cooling would have prevented overheating. Quality gaskets would have sealed reliably. Correct rings would have controlled oil consumption. The Vega could have been a world beater, establishing GM's dominance in compact cars. Instead, it became the beginning of the end. And the people who suffered most were ordinary Americans who trusted GM. They believed the advertising. They saw Motor Trend's award. They expected basic reliability from the world's largest automaker. Instead, they got engines that self-destructed, warranties that weren't honored, and dealers who couldn't help. These weren't enthusiasts who could diagnose problems. They were teachers, nurses, students who needed basic transportation. The Vega failed them catastrophically. And the 2300 engine stands as one of history's greatest engineering failures, not because the technology was impossible, but because it was achievable. Every problem had a solution, every failure was preventable, every disaster was predicted. But corporate culture prevented fixes that engineering could have provided. That's the real tragedy. This disaster was completely avoidable. And yet today's engineers can learn from the Vega's failure. Test thoroughly, listen to warnings, fix problems immediately. Don't let finance override safety. Admit mistakes quickly. Protect reputation above profits. Remember that customers trust you with their lives and livelihoods. These aren't just engineering principles, they're moral obligations. And the Vega 2300 didn't just almost destroy GM. It revealed GM was already destroying itself. The engine was a symptom of deeper disease. Cost-cutting, arrogance, bureaucracy, and denial were eating the company from within. The Vega made these problems visible, but they existed throughout GM's structure. Fix the engine, the problem remains. Fix the culture, and engines fix themselves. And looking back 50 years later, the Vega 2300 serves as a warning. Innovation requires investment. Quality demands time. Reliability needs testing. Trust takes decades to build and seconds to lose. These truths haven't changed. They never will. Every manufacturer who forgets them suffers the same fate. GM forgot and paid the price. The question is, who's next? And in the end, the Vega 2300 story isn't about aluminum or silicon or head gaskets. It's about what happens when corporations forget their purpose. Cars aren't just products, they're promises. Promises of freedom, reliability, safety. When you break those promises to save money, you don't just lose customers, you lose your soul. GM lost its soul in 1970 and spent 40 years trying to find it again. Some say they never did. And the graveyards of automotive history are full of could-have-beens. But the Vega 2300 stands apart. It wasn't ahead of its time. It wasn't impossibly complex. It wasn't even particularly innovative. It was simply executed with criminal incompetence by a company that should have known better. That's what makes it so tragic, and that's why we must remember it. What do you think? Did GM learn from the Vega disaster, or did they repeat the same mistakes with other products? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more engineering deep dives into automotive history's greatest failures and triumphs.